offensive JavaScript techniques for red teamers or anyone really.
Woo! Awesome. Can everyone hear me with my funny rock and roll microphone?
Test, test.
Okay, cool. Awesome. We've got a lot of material to get through in a pretty short time, so we're going to get to it. Thank you everyone for attending. We're going to be talking about offensive JavaScript and how we think it should be used more by offensive red teamers and bug bounty hunters. So my name is Christian. I've contributed to the browser exploitation framework, also known as BEEF. I've co-authored a book on bad JavaScript and presented at a couple of different conferences.
My name's Dylan. I had the opportunity to speak here last year about an open source tool that I wrote called TruffleHog. I've also spoken at a number of different security conferences, including TorCon, DEF CON, and BSides on a number of different AppSec topics.
And KiwiCon for all the New Zealanders in the audience, which we know there's probably at least 2 of you. Yay, applause for the New Zealanders.
So the focus of our talk is going to be on a one-legged unicorn balancing on a beach ball while...
No, the artist isn't listening. You've got to say it again.
All right, hang on. So it's a one-legged unicorn balancing on a beach ball while juggling pogo sticks and 3 tentacles.
The artist is definitely not paid enough for this, I don't think.
So we'll wait. We're also going to be covering some new JavaScript features that make it a lot easier to do exploity things, and we're going to be looking at different ways that we can combine together red team techniques to use these JavaScript features to attack internal networks, and a couple of those include the Fetch API, WebRTC, service workers, and many more.
Sure. And one of the core themes that we'll talk about is this idea in the context of web browsers that actions can be performed cross-origin, despite one of the primary browser controls against this, which is the same origin policy. And for those that maybe don't have too much experience with that, we'll talk about these a little bit more later on as well.
So like I mentioned before, a lot of what we're going to be talking about isn't very novel to AppSec teams, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about isn't very novel to red teams, but we believe the way that we are combining the 2 concepts is kind of unique and special and valuable to both parties. And so there's going to be a little bit of probably dry stuff, but hopefully the overlap is where things get interesting. So if we rewind the clock back a little bit to the mid-2000s, it wasn't too difficult to find a single critical security vulnerability that could completely compromise a company. You could get a SQL injection or remote code execution that could allow you to completely dump a production database and just fully own an entire company. At the time, an attack against the client may not be that interesting because if there's systemic problems that allow you to totally dump a production database, who cares if you can attack a one individual client? So things obviously evolved and got more complicated over time. Red teams started extensively using malware frameworks to compile libraries of exploits and move laterally through environments to chain many different vulnerabilities together. And the thinking there is that these red teams can use these malware frameworks to move through an environment, stay in an environment for a long period of time, and eventually, again, get access to that full production database. So again, we're back to the same, like, client attacks don't really seem super interesting because with these malware frameworks, it's still relatively easy to just completely dump a production database.
So let's talk about the status quo. A lot of organizations suffer from this fallacy that we have called the Lobster security fallacy. Obviously really, really hard on the outside and soft and delicious.
Pretty tasty.
On the inside. And obviously completely secure.
Yep.
As everyone who has done a security assessment from outside an organization knows.
So a big part of this game that we mentioned with the malware frameworks is getting that first foothold. And if we look through something like the Verizon breach report on how this usually happens, the really easy common ways are through either stolen credentials in a data breach or guest credentials or some form of social engineering like phishing. And then once you get that initial first foothold into an environment, Like I mentioned, you use your malware framework to stick around for a while and move from machine to machine, leveraging more and more vulnerabilities, collecting machines like you would Pokemon cards, until eventually you've traded up to that one that's really interesting, the production database. And so to put things into perspective again, if it's relatively easy to get the production database, it seems pretty boring to use a client attack like CSRF to attack an individual client and get one user's data when you could just get every user's data.
Now, obviously, someone who spent a lot of time writing and contributing to a browser exploitation framework, which is meant to do exactly what you have said is boring, I feel personally attacked.
All right, well, I'll keep an open mind. Why don't you tell me more about that?
Sure. So hands up if you've heard of beef. All right, hands up if you've used beef as part of like an official red team engagement. All right, still a few hands. So I owe every one of those people a beer.
Self-validation.
Thank you. Obviously, the idea was beef turned kind of JavaScript client attacks on their head. And wrapping back to the Verizon data breach investigation report, in Dylan's circumstance where you were trying to deliver malware, 12% would open an attachment, but a bigger percentage of people would click a link. And that's an interesting point. And so we ask ourselves, how bad can clicking just a link be?
So before we go any further, by show of hands, how many people have a live browser exploit that can be used to get a remote code execution on a person that clicks a link?
Wait, I saw half a hand.
By all means, I'd be curious to hear from that half hand after. But the reality is these types of exploits are becoming increasingly more difficult. Browsers have different containers and different security features these days that make it so that even if you have one type of vulnerability, you probably don't have the whole farm. Flash is going away. It's been end of life and it's disabled by default in a lot of major browsers. These types of attacks to get remote code execution from clicking a single link, not really a good option anymore.
And one of the themes that I really like to talk about is this concept that the modern day operating system is in fact, it's the browser engine. Chances are you have a smartphone and it's running a browser, probably with a bunch of tabs. Also, chances are if you open your laptop, it's got a couple of windows. And I know we have a previous hiring manager of ours who used to have thousands and thousands of tabs, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't know what was on every single one of those tabs, Angelo. And so, the reality is, this is a really interesting attack surface. A browser is a piece of software that roams around and it simultaneously connects to the internet. It can talk to the local loopback on your machine. It potentially is able to access things over a VPN, and it goes from local network to local network. So it's very, very interesting. And so kind of coming back to this question, how bad can clicking a link be? We think it's pretty bad.
We're going to try to frame the case to make
sure.
See that.
One of the common patterns that you'd see from using something like the browser exploitation is something similar to this. A user clicks a link, a bad website with with malicious JavaScript can get the person's internal IP address using technology such as web real-time communications. And then using that information, it can perform a network sweep to find available hosts near that computer. And then using that can actually find open ports with some limitations against those servers as well. The Beef has a number of modules that can help with these phases, from using WebRTC and doing the port scanning. And this picture here is it's a feature inside of the product where after you run these modules, it'll give you a little diagram, which is kind of really useful.
All right, so it sounds like you're kind of framing the case for how some of these what are usually seen as client attacks, you're using Beef to actually use them to attack infrastructure.
Exactly.
So if a client clicks a link, then you go through that person's browser to attack some internal infrastructure.
Sure.
That sounds pretty interesting, but based on my understandings of the limitations of browsers, it sounds like there's still some challenges here, like the amount of time it might take to do timing attacks and stuff like that, and maybe some same origin policy restrictions. It seems like, in theory that's a good idea, but maybe in practice it doesn't work out too well.
Sure, and certainly a lot of the logic in Beef that does these recon modules against other networks is based on trying to send a request to an IP address on an arbitrary port and waiting for things to fail. It doesn't matter whether or not the same origin policy is going to prevent any of that. Talking about this, though, without actually discussing the same origin policy gets really complicated, so we have a couple of slides on the SOP for those that haven't spent time working on this stuff. And the idea is that browsers have this control inside of them to isolate origins from each other. Generally, this is kind of from like a scheme, hostname, and port. And obviously, some browsers have some nuances because like older versions of Internet Explorer would do SOP controls slightly different. But the idea is that if you have content running in one origin, such as Facebook, it can't arbitrarily send JavaScript to an origin like Google and get data back. Technically, it's broken down into these kind of two high-level buckets. Simple requests are standard form requests or GET requests or other kind of standard web requests that a browser may initiate across origin. And then non-simple requests are literally everything else. So these are potentially requests that are generated from JavaScript, for example, although the Fetch API can send simple requests as well.
This is the bit that always seemed crazy to me, that if you send a post request to another origin, even on another network, that's allowed without asking the server's permission. But if you send a put request, arbitrarily, you have to ask the server's permission ahead of time.
Sure. And that permission chain looks like this. Before the client will send the request that it wants to send, it first of all sends an options request, and it waits to determine if that's something that it's allowed to do. Unfortunately, what the SOP doesn't prevent is this leaking of timing information, because if a host is available, regardless of from just a pure networking perspective, a response will take a little bit, like if a host is unavailable, a response will take longer to fail. And you can use that timing information to do internal network scanning and things like that. And as Dylan alluded to, cross-origin vulnerabilities can be performed through cross-site request forgery and other forms as well. The other topic that makes this really interesting is DNS rebinding, which can really blow this stuff away. We'll talk about it a little bit, but we don't have too much time to cover it in depth. Cross-site request forgery is a pretty well-known vulnerability that web application security people talk about. Typically, these are simple requests which will include a version of state. When you try and protect against these, generally what you're adding is this pre-flight. You're adding a version of the pre-flight artificially by trying to ensure that there's some value that the client knew ahead of time before sending the request to origin. Wrapping back, we're trying to basically talk about, CSR attacks against users are kind of not as woke as against infrastructure.
So I guess when you frame it like that, the fact that you can send post requests and GET requests to every single network that a person is sitting on, the loopback, the VPN, the internal network, just if they click one external link once, that sounds like you might be able to do some bad stuff with it.
Sure. And this is primarily what beef is about. The idea is that you in the middle here are a beachhead. And if you can get arbitrary JavaScript that's hooking back to something else, you can then send other commands to other networks. This could be your coworkers or other internal services. Cross-site scripting forms part of this as well. We're not going to talk about this too much, but the idea is that if you have a vulnerability in your web app, you can obviously run arbitrary JavaScript in that origin. In that instance, that JavaScript can basically emulate anything that the user can do.
And if you're wondering how common these types of vulnerabilities are, this is the readout of HackerOne's most common reported vulnerabilities. These get reported all the time. Cross-site scripting is still by far sitting very comfortably on top. If you run a bug bounty program, you probably see those all the time. Cross-site request forgery is not too far to follow, but still a very common type of vulnerability. And both of these can be used to attack infrastructure. This is an interesting quote from HackerOne where they basically say, generally speaking, stored cross-site scriptings are more impactful than reflected cross-site scriptings. I think what we want to do here today is kind of flip that on its head. And the reason why is if I want to get some reflected cross-site scripting on an internal application and trigger it through a victim that clicks a link, I can do that. But if it's a stored cross-site scripting, I would need some way to store the payload ahead of time. I would need to be able to get that data in and then get them to render it. And the only way to make that happen is additional vulnerabilities. Whereas reflected cross-site scriptings, we can immediately start attacking infrastructure. And so to take a step back and look at what the bigger picture is here, let's say I knew that internally a company is using Jenkins a lot, and I can force a person to send HTTP requests to their internal network if they click my link, and then I get a reflected cross-site scripting in Jenkins. Because Jenkins lets you run code through the web UI, and because JavaScript gives you full access to the web UI, this reflected cross-site scripting gives me remote code execution in Jenkins, And the stored cross-site scripting in this context isn't really that helpful. So if somebody clicks my link, I can use the reflected cross-site scriptings to trigger remote code executions internally at a company. So kind of bringing it all back, we mentioned one of the challenges here might be same origin policy, and we talked about some ways to get around that, but it still seems like if we're attacking an internal network, it's going to take a long time to go through all that. If we're relying heavily on timing to do that,
Yep.
there's going to be some major limitations to using beef.
Definitely, and I'm not going to argue that. Obviously, the window of time where you get JavaScript to run to do like a full network sweep and find all the internal hosts and find all their IP addresses is obviously tricky. Like what happens if the victim closes their tabs? And the premise that we're talking about is trying to get to arbitrary command injection on internal hosts through potentially a single victim who may close their tab pretty fast.
So I think this is where we really take the idea of some red teaming techniques and we combine them ahead of time to do a whole bunch of recon on a company using a wide variety of methods to get everything we need to know about their internal environment ahead of time so that by the time somebody clicks a link, we already know exactly what we're targeting. We have our payload queued up, and immediately we just start attacking them. There are a ton of different recon techniques, and I will not go into all of them, mostly for time reasons, but I will cover 2 of the ones up here, just to kind of get the point across. The way certificate transparency works, basically all SSL certificates from a real certificate authority will be logged in a public ledger called certificate transparency.
Even internal hosts.
And so if you have SSL on your applications, the host name for those applications is very likely being leaked through certificate transparency. And another example of things you can use recon, VirusTotal is a service that advertises itself as free virus scanning for malware samples that you upload to it. And they do that. They will scan it with a whole bunch of different antivirus software. What they don't advertise as much, though, is if you pay VirusTotal a bunch of money, they actually allow anyone to download those samples that people have uploaded. So if you upload some weird internal thing that's got internal host names, anybody can download that if they pay VirusTotal enough. And if you don't want to pay VirusTotal, if you want to just use their free API, as it turns out, they make available to them all the host names that they've found from all the samples that have been uploaded. So it's pretty easy to get a whole list of host names through VirusTotal of a company, because chances are, over a long course of time, folks at that company have uploaded various samples to VirusTotal, including internal host names. I'm not going to go through the rest, but you got the picture at this point. Now, we're going to, at this point, for no arbitrary reason, pick on Netflix. So we've asked ahead of time from one of our friends over at Netflix if we can do this, and they've given us a thumbs up. We don't know anything about Netflix's internal environment. We've never worked there before. We do have some friends over there that we profusely apologize to. But the idea here is we're just going to perform recon on Netflix to see what it looks like. So we're going to start with second-level domains. What this means is, like, if it's something.com or something.org, et cetera, we want to see as many of those domains that we possibly can that are owned by Netflix. So there are a lot of different tools that we can use to do this. One of them is a tool called Passive Total that will show us, in this example, on the left, there's the whois certificate, or sorry, the whois record that's got some information like the email address, the organization, and the street, and the city. Those are all relatively unique to Netflix, and Passive Total will actually allow you to do a reverse search on those fields. So we can see all the other domains that also share those attributes and use them to put together Netflix's portfolio of domains.
And you can just click the button, which is my form of hacking.
It's, yep. How bad can clicking a link be?
How bad?
So on the right side, we've got the SSL certificate, and it's the same exact idea. You'll notice the location is Los Gatos. How many companies are in Los Gatos? I've looked, it's not that many. Most of the Los Gatos certificates actually belong to Netflix. And so when we put this together with, say, crawling their GitHub, looking for host names, going through their mobile app, looking for host names, we end up with more than 500 second-level domains. Too many to list here, and I will not dig into each and every one of these for subdomains for the sake of time. Instead, we're only going to look at subdomains of one of these second-level domains. But you can imagine, like, all of them could have subdomains that correspond to internal host names. So we're just going to pick netflix.com, and we're going to get to work on finding subdomains. We used a bunch of different recon techniques to do this. And by the end of it, what we end up with is thousands of subdomains. We have a small list of them here. As you can see, like some of them look pretty interesting from an attacker standpoint. We have their Confluence, their Puppet server, their Jira, their Artifactory. Not all of these are necessarily still live, but a lot of them probably are. And what we can do is we can use these subdomains to look for things that look like they're open source sounding names. So what we can do once we find one, like for example, if we were to find jenkins.netflix.com, not to say that exists, basically this would allow us to build a payload against that host specifically and target it internally. So it's fair to also assume that if we find a name that's something.netflix.com, there's probably a whole bunch of devs running that thing locally as well. So if we find jenkins.netflix.com, it's probably fair to assume a whole bunch of devs are running Jenkins locally. So if we again put this together, not to pick on Netflix and not to pick on Jenkins, but if we look at the list of cross-site scriptings that have been reported to Jenkins over the last couple of years, they're pretty common. And typically, for one reason or another, they're filed as low severity. We want to, again, frame the case that if you were to get a reflected cross-site scripting in something like Jenkins, it could be game over, even if it's internal.
And one of the really interesting things that happens in this instance as well is it kind of turns the bug bounty from being a black box assessment to being effectively a white box assessment.
That's a really good point.
You can download the open source software yourself and look at the code.
That's a really good point. So yeah, usually you're from an attacker's point of view, if you're attacking something that's external, you don't have the source code for it. But if you're attacking an open source thing that runs internally, you could just rip the source code, run it locally, proxy it, do whatever you need to do. So potentially bug finding is a little easier. So this is just a small piece of JavaScript to see what that could look like if we had such an exploit, like a cross-site request forgery against Jenkins or something like that, to sweep a /24, so 255 hosts. This takes about 30 seconds, so it's pretty quick. So if we knew ahead of time that there's something running internally and we had an exploit queued up and ready to go, we could potentially spray their entire internal network. After 60 seconds, this actually is what unlocks some more deadly attacks. We mentioned DNS rebinding earlier. We won't have time to go into all the specifics of DNS rebinding, but the basic idea is that the definition of an origin does not include an IP address. And so if a DNS server responds with a public IP address the first time and a private IP address the second time, the browser will think that it's talking to the same origin, even though it's talking to a different server. So we can serve our malicious JavaScript under a public IP address, and then using that malicious JavaScript, have it make requests to its own origin. And then the second time the browser does a DNS lookup, the shortest CTL a browser supports is 60 seconds. We can actually respond with an RFC 1819 IP address and have them make that request to an internal host. Now the caveat here is that HTTPS won't really work because certificates, common names won't match up because your external host name isn't going to be the same as your internal host name. But everything non-SSL, we can basically completely get rid of the same origin policy and just fully make requests and view response to hosts without relying on cross-site request forgery bugs.
And what about all the expensive firewalls that we have?
That's a great question. Because the person clicking the link is already sitting on the network behind the firewall, we've already bypassed that. And so the user, their browser can make full requests to loop back, to internal hosts, to VPNs. They're already sitting behind the firewall, and so we're pretty much able to completely blow past that. Pretty much everything on the internal network that does not use SSL or that's running locally basically becomes external, and the attacker can fully make requests and view responses as if there were no restrictions to the entire internal network just by holding somebody on a page for 60 seconds. NCC has put out a framework called Singularity, and we've met with those folks and talked with them. They're building out capabilities in Singularity that will basically allow you to click a malicious link, and then Singularity will rebind to your entire internal network. It'll look at the responses coming back, log all of them, and if it matches a signature of something it knows it's vulnerable, it'll auto-upload exploits to it, and you'll be able to hook in interpreters and stuff like that. So this DNS rebinding stuff is really dangerous, and I wish we could cover it more, but we got to keep covering other techniques as well.
So obviously in these examples, we're talking about rebinding to IP addresses, but during the recon, we didn't get IP addresses, we got CNAMEs. Like, can we do that?
Yeah, so during our recon, we were able to get a portfolio of potential DNS records that a company is running internally. You're absolutely right that when we do our DNS rebinding, we don't have to point to an IP address. We can just point to a CNAME. And because we already have thousands of hosts that we know are probably already internal, we don't have to do any guesswork at all. We can just completely do our DNS rebinding to all the hosts that we already know are there, and then immediately start exfiltrating data.
Awesome.
So now we're going to cover a bunch of real-world examples that I've used in bug bounties that are unrelated to Netflix or Jenkins or anything that we've talked about so far. What I want to show here is that this process is actually relatively easy to do, and I've done it a couple of times. So basically, there's some company that was running a piece of software called ReviewBoard. They were running it at reviewboard.company.com that I was able to find through Recon. This company ran a bug bounty program, and so I looked up ReviewBoard. I saw what it was. It was a code review tool. I pulled it down. I ran it locally. I had access to the source code, and I started looking for web bugs. And of course, it's a web application, and it's a web application that not a lot of security researchers are looking at. So it was filled with web bugs. It had cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery. And because it was white box, they were relatively easy to find. So when we kind of combine all this together, what we end up with is a link that if somebody at this company clicks, we can use cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery to completely steal all the source code at this company. So we have a link that if somebody clicks, immediately I just get all the source code. We see here when I disclosed to ReviewBoard, they were great about it. They fixed it really quick. And then when we pop stack again and move back to the bug bounty, the response was kind of interesting. They said, well, we're running this internally, and we appreciate you reaching out to ReviewBoard and getting this fixed, but we didn't really write this code, and it doesn't really jive well with our scope, so we're not going to pay you, but thanks for submitting.
Wah, wah.
Again, this pattern is going to get a little repetitive, but there was another company running a tool called GeoCD.devops.company.network. I had no idea what GeoCD was, so I Googled it. I found it was an open source thing. Pulled down that source code. I run it locally, and by default, it has no authentication, so that's off to a good start.
Cool.
I'm able to proxy the requests, and with enough poking at it, I find that it's got a particular endpoint that is not validating CSRF tokens. The application was generally good about CSRF, but there was this one endpoint that just wasn't validating the token. And this endpoint was to build an environment.
Not important at all, obviously.
And so when we put all this together, what we end up with is if somebody clicks a link, then we can build an environment internally at this company by GeoCD's definition of what an environment is. Not super great. What happened here is I knew somebody that was working at this company, and I reached out to them, and I explained this whole thing to them, and I said, I know you have a bug bounty, like, I had a bad experience before, should I bother submitting this? And he said, you know, like, I understand where the other company was coming from, like, this really, you know, isn't going to be in scope, and we didn't write that code, so don't bother submitting, but thank you for finding this. And so I didn't. One more time, same exact process. We find some company running some open source thing. In this case, the thing is actually a relatively older piece of software. The source code is on SourceForge, globalsite.company.com. And again, we're going to pull the source code down, we're going to run it locally, and we're going to pen test it. And here, what we actually find are some worse types of vulnerabilities. We find cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery. We also find remote code execution through the file upload and some other serious bugs. So when we put all this together, what we have end-to-end is someone clicks a link, and then we use the cross-site scripting to just directly install a web shell and trigger the web shell. And now at this point, we've got somebody who clicks a link, and immediately I have a shell in their internal company. This is obviously a pretty severe impact, and when I presented this to the company, they definitely got the picture and the scope of impact, and they compensated pretty well. So the results from submitting these types of bugs to bug bounties has been kind of varied, and we could talk about that more in a bit, but in this particular case, the company was appreciative of the finding. But hopefully I've gotten the point across that this is really easy to do. If you want to target a company and you want to get a foothold into an environment and you want to constrain yourself to the foothold is only a person clicking a link, it's not that much effort to be able to do what I showed.
So, obviously going back to this same problem though, we do have still some challenges with this limited time window, and there are other options that we have available to us, such as service workers. Similarly, we don't have time to go into this in depth, but service workers is a relatively new browser capability that actually allows you to run JavaScript after the tabs have closed. Typically, you only get about a window of 5 minutes, but some great researchers, Emmanuel Law from Google and Claudio from ZX Security out of New Zealand, they figured out how you could do it for 30 minutes. And running 30 minutes of JavaScript after the window has closed is obviously petrifying, and they allow certain degrees of cross-origin requests. So, in this instance, it can only run over TLS, and it can't do mixed content or no blocking requests.
It's funny because the DNS rebinding is only over non-TLS, and the service workers are only over TLS.
Sure.
So we have a nice portfolio of attacks.
So using these, we can do things like we can potentially spray all the HTTPS hosts that we know about from our recon. We can potentially spray the loopback as well, because quite often people run applications and they actually listen on the local loopback. I'm not too sure how many people realize that Tmux has a local loopback.
For Windows, it does.
Yeah.
We should also mention that there is an exception to the TLS rule, and that is loopback. Service workers do allow you to make non-TLS requests to loopback.
Cool. So in closing, really quick, just reframing these problems, browsers obviously have access to multiple contexts. If you're using, if you're doing a red team assessment where you have a pretty open scope, you should definitely be using this as part of your assessment. Recon really, really helps. And quite often this is like a different way to exploit recon, because red teamers are generally doing this, but now you've actually got ways to be able to send requests to internal hosts. New browser features are obviously really interesting. WebAssembly and a bunch of other things are coming down the pipeline, so take the time to research those things.
And I think one point that I really want to drive home here is if you're running a bunch of open source stuff in your internal network, like really consider either putting it in scope for the bug bounty or putting some effort specifically into improving the security of that open source software. Submit your patch upstream, get other companies to be more secure as a result. A lot of people just blindly run open source stuff internally without thinking about it too much. But the reality is those projects don't have the funding or the resources to secure them.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to these people. If you want to come and talk to us for questions, we're at a booth called, it's a cruise booth.
We'll be outside for a bit as well.
Thanks, everyone.